Welcome everybody here in the University Hall, and also welcome to everyone who is watching the live stream tonight. My name is Hilke Grotelaar and I will be your host for tonight. This is the first evening in a new series named Rethinking Global Power, in which we examine the geopolitical chess game between the global powers. This evening, and the series is in cooperation between Studium Generale, the Utrecht Centre for Global Challenges Contesting Governance, and SIB Utrecht. So the global power shift has been going on for a while now. The rise of China as an economic superpower and Europe's wavering diplomatic course. But a war in Europe was not what we expected. During this evening, we will delve deeper into the question in what ways the war in Ukraine changes our understanding of geopolitical developments. More specifically, we are looking at the question whether the war in Ukraine is an opportunity for China to increase its influence. So what is actually China's role in the global economic governance? These and many more questions will be answered by our guest, political economist Dr. Jue Wang. Jue Wang is an international political economy scholar from Leiden University, and she focuses on China's political economy, the external economical relationships, and its role in regional and global governance. She's currently completing a book on China's evolving role in regional and global economic governance, in which she focuses on the dynamic interactions with institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. Her other current research project focuses on the origins and implications of China's recent economic slowdown, the revision of the market economy, and China's overseas investments. Jue will be interviewed tonight by Eelco Bos van Roosendaal, who is a host and reporter at Nieuwsuur. Before he worked as a correspondent in the United States for NOS News, and he made recently a trilogy series on how the war in Ukraine is disrupting the shaky balance of world powers. Before we start, I will end with some practicalities. This interview will last about 50 minutes. And afterwards, there will be plenty of time for you all to pose questions. I will walk around with this microphone. And for those of you who are watching online, you can post the questions in the chats. So now give a warm applause for our guests, Jue Wang and Eelco Bos van Roosendaal.
Thank you all very much. And very warm welcome. I'm sitting on my, I'll put it here. Thank you very much, Dr. Wang, for
having me here.
Thank you for coming on this beautiful location. There's plenty to discuss. We're going to talk about the economy mostly, Chinese economy. But when we're talking about the Chinese perspective, and we'll be discussing the Chinese perspective during the entire evening, is there even such a thing as the Chinese perspective, or is that already too simple?
I think that's a very good question to start with. So the short answer is that's too simple, because there is not I always say we shouldn't see China as one single entity. Of course, we know it's a sovereign state, but there are all kinds of domestic actors which have different interests, different priorities. The state government, the party, in the economic sector, the state-owned enterprises, banks, people on the coastal area versus people in the rural area in the West, right? In the poorer places. They have different views, they have different priorities. They are influenced by the government's policy in different ways, and they also influenced by China's way of engaging globalization in different ways. So yes, the short answer is one China space, one China voice is obviously too simple.
Yeah, in the West we tend to think that of all the things you just mentioned, the people on the coast, the people in the cities, etc., you mentioned the party, and in the West we tend to think that the party overrules everything. So we can talk about state and province governments, but why bother? Because the party is in control. But that is too simple as well, basically.
Yeah, that is too simple. Obviously, China has a very strong state. The state plays important role in making industrial policies, making 5-year plans, right? The state used to be, the central machine to make all the strategies and the policies during the central plan years in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But since 1980s, there have been a whole series of market-oriented reforms, transitions happening in the Chinese market, Chinese society. So now there are a whole range of actors playing important roles. Right. But then, of course, the state itself is still very powerful. Sure. In obvious policy making, but also in people's daily life, right? They also are part of general decision-making scheme, of course, but then there are other actors.
So we'll talk about China as an emerging superpower, which is almost a cliche by now, but we'll talk about what it exactly means, and we'll also talk about the more recent economic slowdown. But we cannot talk about China and its place in the world without mentioning what's going on in the world right now, which is the war in Ukraine. So let's just start with that briefly. It has been my impression that China doesn't want to pick sides too obvious. They support Russia, or at least not condemn Russia in the Security Council, but they don't vocally support the invasion. How does China pick its position in this conflict? What do they want, basically?
Right. Obviously, it's a very timely, intriguing question, right? That's has been going on for all these months. Maybe we can go back a little bit to look at China's foreign policy. So what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, to start with, it's not in China's top list interest of foreign policy, to start with.
It's a distraction, basically.
Exactly. It's not something they care the most about in terms of economic foreign policies, right? Economic foreign policy-wise, China cares about the trade relationship with the US, with Europe, trade relationship with its neighbors, because since the trade war, actually in 2021, ASEAN replaced the EU countries to be China's biggest trade partner.
The Asian countries.
Exactly, the Southeast Asian countries.
Right, yeah.
And also China has this ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, investing in developing countries in Africa, in Central Asia, in Latin America, etc. Sorry, not COVID.
Not COVID.
So it's not the core of China's economic foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It might not be the core of China's foreign policy in terms of security either. China's security core of interest is Taiwan Strait, relationship with the US. Yeah. But then, of course, Russia is important. Russia is a neighbor. Russia is a superpower neighbor, right? Russia is a nuclear power. China has always been keeping an ambiguous relationship with Russia, I would say. Russia is, I wouldn't say Russia is a friend of China, because historically they had some tense between China and the Soviet, especially in the 60s and the 70s, even after the Soviet ended. During the Russian period, China keeps a distance, because China needs Russia to be there to some sort of buffer zone in terms of against the US, right? So in a way, China needs Russia to be a strategic partner, but then Russia is not
necessarily a friend.
Not necessarily a friend.
Yeah.
So that's why when something like the war happened, it became unclear for China to pick a position.
Right.
I think China would want this war to end as soon as possible, so that the global supply chain can come back to normal state, and so that China's relationship with Europe can improve a little bit, which is apparently at this moment more important for China during the pandemic, when China's own economy is being affected.
Final thing on this, you mentioned the Taiwan Strait, and the question for many people is obviously the Taiwan issue, which is also, however Beijing sees it, but a province with a big neighbor such as Ukraine and Russia. What are the takeaways for China from the war in Ukraine when it comes to Taiwan? Does the war in Ukraine make things more likely or less likely that there will be an invasion within 2 decades, or would that be pure speculation?
I don't think China is using what's happening in Russia and Ukraine as the only measure as an evaluation of the possibility of getting involved in a war in the Taiwan Strait. Obviously, the US said that they would be involved if something like that happened. So I think, and obviously this issue has been there forever, for a really long time, right? So they've had, I'm sure the army, the government has had all kind of scenarios. What happens in terms of the US, in terms of the current ruling party in Taiwan, if they change strategy, how should we react? I don't think the Russia-Ukraine situation is a main measure, to influence their next step decision. But
we'll have to wait and see. Let's talk about China as an economic powerhouse, which is your main field of expertise. We're at the university, so we can do a Chinese economy 101 lesson. I have always learned that China's rise to prosperity began when they became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2000. But I'm sure I'm wrong, and it probably started earlier. When were the seeds sown for what we now describe as China's economic rise?
You're not wrong. China's WTO membership very much remarked the start of China's rapidest growth in the past 100 years, right? But it didn't start there, right? It started, I would say, in the modern history, I would say China's current rapidly growing economy is mostly due to its opening up and the reform in the late 1970s. We know that Chairman Mao passed away in 1976, which created some opportunities for changing of political power within the party, or changing economic development trajectories, the directions, and that happened. So at the late 1970s, a group of policymakers led by Deng Xiaoping decided to take China to a different direction, in a way to drift away from this central plan economic decision-making to a more market-oriented one. So I think that was the start of the success we see nowadays.
Because before that, if I may interrupt you, before that, China in every way was much more isolated as well, before China the 1970s.
Absolutely, China was more isolated from the Western world. China had...
But also from the rest of Asia, or not?
Yes. you're correct. China had some trade links with the Soviet, with some former Eastern European countries, with some socialist, communist country, but a small group of countries. But it was mostly isolated from the rest of Asia, rest of the Western world. Starting from the 1970s, they start to realize that China was very much behind other Asian countries, East Asian countries like Japan, like South Korea, etc., in terms of economic development. Because by the 1970s, Japan and South Korea were already doing very well. They were already entering a high growth period, thanks to the policies they adopted after the war for economic development. So that was when the Chinese government realized that maybe we can do something to get reconnected. And that was also the reconnection started when Nixon visited China in 1972. And also they recovered diplomatic relationship with Japan in the 1970s, which was a big move, right? After the Japan invasion in the 1930s and the 40s. But eventually, Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues decided to not only connect back to the world, but also started to take China domestically to a different direction, to embrace the market more, to embrace more market-oriented liberalization. So I think that was one key reason, one key to today's success. But then another important factor was they did not abandon the communist regime immediately. They did it gradually. So that was a difference between China and the Soviet and some of the East European countries. They did it gradually. In China, there's a famous term called crossing the river by touching the stones.
Crossing the river by touching the stones.
Touching stones.
Right.
So you can imagine there's a creek, right? The creek, the water goes down. You cannot see how deep the water is. There are some stones. You try to cross. You're not sure about your steps. Then you touch around to see if it is safe enough.
Sure.
So basically, doing by trying. Learning by doing, right? So the Chinese government in the 80s, 90s, they were very pragmatic, very flexible. So they were willing to make experiment. If it worked, let's go for it. For example, the special economic zones in the southeast coast of China, they decided to open up these regions. Implement more flexible foreign direct investment policies in order to attract investment from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and later
in certain areas of China.
In certain areas. They actually started in 4 specific cities, Shenzhen, Shantou, Xiamen, and Zhuhai. So
as an experiment, basically.
As experiment. It's actually interesting choice of cities because they're in the southeast coast. They were far away enough from Shanghai, from Beijing, from the northeast, which was the center of heavy industry back in the 60s and 70s. So if the things didn't work out, it's far away from the core of China's political and economic.
And there would not be unrest or whatever. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And it wouldn't also create too big of a damage, right? But also because these cities were very close to Taiwan and Hong Kong. And many people moved away from these cities and these areas to Hong Kong and Taiwan before the 1940s, started from 19th century actually. So it would be natural for the businessman in Taiwan to come back to the mainland, to these cities, to invest in where their ancestors moved from, right? To open up a factory, to hire local people. And that's exactly how it worked.
What happened?
These people came back. And then later on in the 1980s, 14 other cities on the coastal area said, we also want to be special economic zone. Right, these 4 cities.
And they got it.
And they got it. Nowadays, of course, you can probably invest pretty much everywhere in China. You don't need that special status.
Yeah.
But back then, it was very important for the government to be willing to make an experiment, to try out, to be flexible. So I think that was a very important factors of China's switch, of China's takeoff. But then, of course, like you said, the WTO membership played an important role. China...
Because then it took another...
Exactly. China wanted to join from 1986, but eventually it joined in 2001. So it took a whole decade and a half. And through this decade and a half, China made a whole series of reforms, the liberalization, because you imagine in order to join WTO, you need to make sure your domestic economy is somehow aligned with the global market. Otherwise,
certain
other people
benchmarks.
exactly. Otherwise, other people wouldn't want to do trade with you, right? So China liberalized, reformed in all kinds of sectors, in exporting, in importing, in the financial sector, etc. Eventually, it joined in 2001, and from then on, it became the world's manufacturing center because it had such a big population, such a big labor resources to utilize to produce the products, and China became the world's biggest export. It still is today, but it's a bit different nowadays. Back then, it was more labor intensive. Nowadays, they aim for more technology.
Is it a unique mix of communism and capitalism? I mean, how would you describe the economic philosophy? Well, I guess the economic philosophy is pure capitalism.
Right. Yeah. They a lot of market incentive. Right. A lot of bottom-up incentive. A lot of you see labor movement as well. A lot of Chinese people move from the west of China to the coastal area, to Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong province, which were a lot of these factories were, still are. So a lot of dynamism going on in China's labor market, in China's market. So these are all the factors of what we call capitalism, right? But then, of course, the state played an important role in the sense that it made these big strategic moves, right? To decide that we want to be part. We wanted to open up. We wanted to be part of WTO. Every 5-year plan that the Chinese government made sent a lot of signals, guided the Chinese economy through. So you do see a combination of central policy making at the state level. Of course, they also delegate a lot of detailed decision making to local level governments. But you see this complicated government decision making network along with market dynamism. So I think that is a key to its success. On the state level, they make strategies. They guide China towards general big directions. And also, let's not forget all these state-owned enterprises, right? China has a huge, this gigantic companies, state-owned. And they are nowadays investing abroad. You probably many of you in the audience have heard about Belt and Road Initiative, China's investment in Africa, in Latin America.
We're going to discuss that in a second. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, please,
right, building roads. So a lot of these projects are operated by state-owned enterprise as the primary contractor.
Yeah.
So they are big economic machines of the government.
Right.
So you see a strong state sector, but also vibrant market. So I think that explains China's economic success.
Now you mentioned innovation briefly. I mean, the cliche image is obviously that China is producing all the cheap stuff we buy, and that there's not as much innovation as you would expect. But is that the case, or is that now really an outdated image, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. So that's a good one. You still see a lot of cheaper goods, right, from China coming to developed countries, but also to developing markets. So Chinese goods are popular in African market, in the Middle East market, because they are cheaper. They have good enough functions. For example, garments, clothes, you still see these kind of toys, right? Plastic goods. You still see these products with the lower technology elements. Still, they are a big part of the market. But you also start to see products which has higher technology elements, right? You see these mobile phones, Huawei, Xiaomi, this kind of products. Another interesting thing is Chinese mobile phones, for example, are very popular in Africa, right? They are cheaper.
The mobile phones.
Mobile phones, yeah. They are much cheaper than iPhone, right?
Everything in life is cheaper than an iPhone.
Right. Right, so they are much cheaper than iPhone. And they are smart. They customize for African market. For example, I haven't done research myself, but I've heard other scholars talking about the case studies of this Chinese mobile phone company, Transsion. They entered the African market quite early, and now they customize their products just for the African market. Many people in China don't know this brand, but in Africa, it's the biggest brand.
What's it called?
Transsion.
Okay.
Transsion. For example, they would invest in making their battery lasting very long. So you charge for a very short period of time, but the battery lasts for very long. Because apparently in Africa you still have quite often how do you call it, the blackout, when the electricity is cut off.
Blackout,
right? Yeah, exactly. So during that period you cannot charge your phone, right? So it's important to have the technology that you charge for a short period of time, the battery lasts for long. Maybe it doesn't have as good as navigation or other function compared to iPhone or other brand. But with that kind of function, it is popular in Africa.
Right.
So that's just one small example to show that Chinese companies, let's not try to avoid use the big word China.
Right.
Chinese companies, both state companies and private companies, they are trying very hard to improve the technology to make their products popular in developing markets as well as in developed markets. And you've probably also heard the Made in China 2025, right? That's the main industrial policy nowadays. The government wants by 2025 China become not only a manufacturing center of cheap goods, but manufacturing center of goods with high technology. So that's the aim. That's where
made
they
in
try
2025, and is that going according to schedule? Do we know?
Partially, yeah. We do start to see high tech, right, in AI, in digital economies, in digital products, etc. But still in some other technologies, microchips or space technologies, probably still a distance if you compare to Europe or the US. Yeah.
Now you mentioned, and I guess that's a very important thing to talk about, the Belt and Road Initiative, like the new Silk Route, right? Which started almost 10 years ago, I think 2013.
Correct.
And it's a gigantic, ambitious plan China had, right? Infrastructure basically all over the world. I think a lot of soft power was involved as well. Can you talk about the grand ambition that China had with has with the Belt and Road Initiative, and where we stand right now, where China stands right now, because not everything is going according to plan, I believe.
Right, yes.
What was the ambition?
It's actually a complicated question because Belt and Road Initiative was not something completely new starting from 2013. China already started to invest in developed countries and developing countries from the 1990s, right? And China had this going global policy in 1999.
Okay.
So Belt and Road Initiative is very much an extension of China's investment abroad, right? So why was China so keen to invest abroad? You know, this going global started from 1999 and became even more grand strategy sounding outward expansion strategy like Belt and Road Initiative. Right. There are both domestic and external reasons. Maybe in the beginning, the domestic reason was probably the dominating one because the Chinese government started to realize the problem of overcapacity, right? The overcapacity in sectors like transportation, energy, construction, right? And China gained a lot of experience in infrastructure advancement. China is very good. China became very good at building roads, railways, harbors. In Chinese, there's a saying that if you want to get wealthy, build the road first, because that's how your village gets connected to the outside. That's when the exchange and the trade starts, right? So China became experienced. China invested a lot into infrastructure, but also transportation, also energy. Sure. But these sectors reached the point that they had overcapacity. Because you imagine you cannot build the roads forever. At some point, there's going to be enough roads, right? Like China is a huge country. Right. But at some point, there would be enough roads, enough harbors. But then there are huge sectors, people being employed behind these sectors. So how do you make sure these sectors continue to grow? You start to build the roads abroad, right? And at the same time, there was a huge need in developing countries for hard infrastructure. Right. So that worked out perfectly. Yeah. And also the government wanted the Chinese companies to go out to be a more active part of the international market, right? In terms of in developed countries like Europe and in the US. They could learn a lot, by collaborating, acquiring, merging with these established European companies, or by investing, opening up a new greenfield companies in Europe. They could learn a lot. They could a lot of technologies and more advanced management skills from Europe. So in this way, it would help Chinese companies to grow, to help Chinese brands to grow. And it's still going on. This kind of aim is still rolling out, right? So this didn't start in 2013. This started before. But 2013...
They put a label on it also.
Exactly. They put a label on it. After the label was there, it attracted a lot of attention, right? Some attention generated a very conducive driving force for the Chinese because, the African governments were enthusiastic about it. Some Middle Eastern governments were enthusiastic. The Chinese are coming to invest. Let's talk with them. Let's assess the situation, and let's embrace this opportunity. Right? It created conducive driving force, but it also generated a bit of friction in the sense that, now especially in the West, now the Chinese are investing. What does that mean for us?
Imperialistic, yeah.
Exactly. So you see in the US, in India, Japan, EU have somehow all raised the voice to questioning the way China does investment in these developing countries. Is this really good for developing country? What does it mean for us? So now it has become a grand strategy, right? It sounds like a grand strategy. It has attracted good attention, but also created some friction. Maybe in the beginning, China's Belt and Road Initiative was more economically motivated, but now we see a lot of strategic, geopolitical implications associated with this big project.
One other thing, and then we'll move on a bit to the economic slowdown, which is now also happening. And you're researching that right now, how China is dealing with the World Bank, the IMF, or perhaps work around it and build its own institutions. Can you talk about that? What is it exactly the goal, and can they simply step away? I mean, they have to deal with the World Bank, for instance, as well, right? What is the idea behind that?
Right, so World Bank is a multilateral development bank. It's part of the Bretton Woods Institution. IMF is part of the Bretton Woods Institution, and Bretton Woods Institution, together with the WTO, are the leading global institutions that promote liberal economic norms.
That every country is supposed to adhere to.
Exactly, to promote a free market, to promote free circulation of capital. China does things a bit differently, right? China also invests in a lot of development projects, bilateral investment in Africa, in other developing countries. Compared to the World Bank, compared to other multilateral development banks, China tend to do investment or offer loans with less political conditions attached. In the sense that World Bank or Western countries, they would provide a fund, but they would require the recipient countries to implement some political
civil society,
human rights, democratization. Money needs to be used in certain way. You need to tell us how you use money. But China looks more at the economic profit. Whether that project, first of all, I invest there, I can get some profit back. Right? The China does not offer money for free because it itself still needs part of it is still developing. China needs money itself as well. So it obviously is not just offering money for free. China also needs economic profit from it. China has a whole bunch of state-owned enterprise that need to profit from
They want a return on the investment. Basically.
Exactly. And also China follows this non-interference, non-interference, non-intervention policy, because China obviously does not want its own domestic politics to be interfered by others, and so China also try not to get involved, not to judge, not got involved, and not to push for democratization or this kind of political changes as a condition to the money, to the investment. So China does things a bit differently. Also, one difference is China tends to get more of its own state companies to be involved. Often, the condition would be the contracts goes to the Chinese company. which is also a bit of a problem for European companies. So, or American companies or Japanese companies, if all the deals go to, also could be a problem for the recipient country, right? If the deals, contracts go to Chinese company, then how much can we benefit from collaborating with you, right? You want to collaborate with us, how much can we earn from this?
So not everybody is as enthusiastic about these investments as perhaps they were in the beginning.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a difference the way China does things compared to the Western way, the World Bank way, the Asian Development Bank way. And then China was also not happy with the fact that its voting power was rather low in the World Bank, in the IMF, in these international institutions. The World Bank is very much led by the US, and the Asian Development Bank is co-led by Japan and the US, and China's voting power is much lower compared to these they were meant to be the leader. It was built under their initiative, right?
Yeah, no, the US controls the World Bank in many
exactly.
ways, but can China just pull out? Can they just say, we'll build our own set of rules?
That wouldn't be ideal, because you say you want to be a leading power, right? Exactly. Pulling out from it is not the right thing to do. But actually, China has had a not bad relationship with the World Bank, one-to-one relationship, because the World Bank has contributed a lot to China's own development.
Right.
It's just gradually, as China became a more developed, become a more confident, China tend to, do things differently. And China also realized it could do things differently at the same time, right? China could be a part of World Bank, IMF. Meanwhile, China does things outside of these institutions and bilaterally. Actually, China contributes a lot more resources into bilateral actions compared to these multilateral actions. But this kind of dissatisfaction difference between China and these Western-based institutions, many people say this became a main reason why China wanted to establish an alternative institution. So China, under China's leadership, they created this bank called Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So it's like a World Bank under China's leadership.
And that is recently?
That's recent. That was 2016.
Okay.
And also China, together with other BRICS countries, established a new development bank. So again, that's a development bank for BRICS countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So you see these emerging powers. They do things again
the global
differently.
South.
Exactly, compared to the Western powers.
If we move on, let's take a brief look at the time. To the economic slowdown, which happened recently. Economists expect hardly 4% growth this year of the Chinese economy. Some say the average will be 2 or 3% after over the next few years, as opposed to 10% growth 15, 20 years ago. I suppose that COVID is one reason, but there must be plenty of other reasons. Why is there now a slowdown in the economy?
There has been slowdown since 2008, actually. 2007, I think, annual growth rate, GDP growth rate was 14.2. And now, like you said, it's much lower than that, right? In the beginning, I think it was somehow affected by the global financial crisis, started from the US in 2008, and then later on there was the credit crisis in Europe as well, 2009. Remember, Greece and Spain were hit quite seriously. So China was affected by that, not directly, but indirectly, because the Western countries were important trade partners. When your trade partners are affected, your economy is also affected, right? Because from 2001 and 2008, China increased really fast as a big exporter. And who was buying Chinese goods? The Europeans, the US. So China was affected. But that was not the only reason. Also domestically, China's labor advantage was declining because of aging population to start with, but also because the rising living cost, rising production cost means the cheap Chinese labor, not that cheap anymore, right? China's labor advantage was declining. Also because overcapacity, and also it's sort of a naturally you see the trajectory of economic development. Many countries, they develop at very fast speed, and eventually they start to slow down, right? You see these developed countries, the growth rate is much lower than the developing countries.
Is it something that worries the party or the Chinese government a lot, or do they basically think this is
accept the situation? No, they did not accept the situation. They try to bring the growth rate back up. They tried to, in 2010, they poured 4 trillion into the market, tried to, stimulate the market, but in the end it did not really work out well. But they try all kind of ways, right? They try to develop the Chinese economy in a more balanced way. They try to move the concentration a bit away from export to domestic consumption, because China has a huge domestic market. Even if the export is hurt because of the external shocks, you still could have a vibrant domestic market to consume these products. So the government has tried to make all kinds of efforts to keep up, to maintain the growth.
A zero COVID policy, which is in place right now, doesn't help, right?
Exactly.
People stuck in their homes, travelers not coming in. Is it something because of the economic downturn that the government may step away from?
Yes. Like I said, the government has been making effort, but quite unfortunately, I actually would say, trade war with the US happened in 2018. That does not help with the domestic reforms, domestic stimulation, right? And then pandemic. Chinese economy is quite affected by the pandemic, the war, the Ukrainian war. All these elements lead to somehow contributed to the low growth rate you're talking about just now. And the zero COVID policy makes it even worse, right? Maybe that's not the most precise way to say it. The zero tolerance COVID policy does not help with boost the economy.
Of course.
But I assume the government decided that that's their priority for the moment, to make sure the virus does not spread. Make sure people believe that it's the right approach, and people think they feel safe. I think that the government decided that's their priority.
That's the main priority.
There are political reasons behind, but there are also practical reasons behind it. The data shows that there's still a big base of rural residents. Also urban residents, older people who decide not to get vaccinated. And also, since this virus did not spread in China like it did in the US and Europe or other parts of the world. So essentially, the government and the people, they don't know how it would affect China, right? Seeing so many people are not vaccinated, and knowing there's a possibility of this could cause death, they decided to take on the conservative
on the careful side. Before we go to audience questions, one last question for you, which I'm wondering, What's the biggest misconception about China? Because I'm sure you get to hear quite a bit either while teaching or stuff I say. What's the biggest misconception, and what is something that the audience should take away from discussing China?
Right. So not necessarily a misconception, but I can go back to how we started. That is, people tend to see China as a single entity, right? China this, China that. They somehow associate the word China to this centrally decided strong party state
Right.
that makes all the decisions. Chinese people somehow follow it.
Yeah.
It's one whole entity. It's actually not true.
Much too simple.
Exactly,
Yeah.
it's much too simple.
Very clear.